My name's Mark. This happened in 2018 when I was 34. I lived in Tennessee at the time, just outside of Crossville, in a rental house that backed into a long stretch of woods. I worked a warehouse job during the week, nothing special, just stacking and loading pallets for a logistics company. My days were simple, and my nights even quieter. Camping was one of the few things I looked forward to on my days off. I wasn't into fancy campgrounds or heavily trafficked trails. I liked the deep woods, places where I could sit under the trees and hear absolutely nothing man-made. It helped me shut my brain off. There was a spot I'd found on an old hunting map called Crooked Hollow, about 20 miles south of where I lived. I'd never seen anyone else out there, and the only way in was through a barely noticeable trailhead off a one-lane road. No signs.
No markers.
If you didn't know about it, you'd never find it. I packed light for that trip, just my internal frame pack, a one-man tent, a tarp, a steel mug, and enough food and water for 3 days. My plan was to hike in on a Friday morning, spend 2 nights out, and be back home Sunday afternoon. It was early October, and the air had that crisp edge in the mornings that reminded you summer was gone. The leaves hadn't fully changed, but there were orange and yellow patches here and there in the treetops. The trail into Crooked Hollow wasn't really a trail anymore. Years of erosion had turned it into a rough cut through the undergrowth, barely a footpath in places. By the time I got to the clearing I always used to set up camp, it was close to noon. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across, but it was flat and dry. A thin stream ran about 30 yards east of it, and there were enough trees nearby to break the wind, but not so many that it felt claustrophobic. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping pad, and fixed a quick lunch. I didn't have any plans after that. I just wanted to be still for a while. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire after sunset, listening to the woods and watching the flames dance. Around midnight, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up. The wind moved through the trees like soft breathing. It was peaceful. I slept straight through till dawn. The second day, I decided to explore a bit deeper into the woods. I followed the stream eastward, figuring I'd loop around and circle back by mid-afternoon. I brought my pack, my knife, and a liter of water. After maybe an hour of walking, I noticed the stream bed starting to widen. It wasn't deep, maybe ankle-high in the deepest parts, but it split around a small rise of land that had clearly been formed by erosion over years. I decided to cross over the higher ground and see what was beyond it. That's when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could see at first, more like a feeling. The woods got quieter. I realized I hadn't heard a single bird since crossing the ridge. No insects either. The leaves under my boots sounded louder than they should have. Every step felt like it echoed a little too long. I thought about turning back, but something kept pushing me forward. I followed the flattened strip of earth past the ridge, stepping over broken branches and rotted tree trunks, until I caught a weird shape ahead of me in the underbrush. It was a blue tarp. At first I thought it was just an old hunting blind or maybe some trash someone dumped years ago. But as I got closer, I saw it was pinned down at the corners with large rocks. It looked out of place, too clean and deliberate to be old garbage. The edges weren't frayed. The color hadn't faded. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at it. There was a strange smell in the air, sweet but rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. I tried to tell myself it was just a dead animal, maybe a deer. That wasn't uncommon out here, but something about the shape of the tarp didn't sit right. It wasn't crumpled or torn. It had a distinct outline underneath, lumpy at the ends but smoother in the middle. I could see where the tarp dipped slightly, as if whatever was under it had settled. I don't know why I pulled it back. Curiosity, I guess, or maybe something deeper. When I moved the rocks and peeled the tarp back, I immediately knew it wasn't an animal. It was a man. His body had been there a while, maybe a week or two, based on the way his skin had started to bloat and pull tight over his face. His eyes were gone. Whether animals had taken them or they just decomposed, I couldn't tell. His mouth was open, his lips pulled back in a way that made it look like he was trying to scream, but there was no sound. He was wearing jeans and a brown flannel shirt, both stained and stiff. His boots were still on. One of his hands was clenched so tightly that the skin had split across the knuckles. I backed away fast. My heart was thudding in my chest, and I felt sick. I turned and vomited into the underbrush. My head was spinning. My brain was trying to catch up to what my eyes had seen. I hadn't brought my phone. I never did on camping trips, mostly because there was no reception out here anyway. I had no GPS, no radio, just me and the woods. I stared back at the body, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to run, but another part kept me there, like I owed it to this man to make sure someone found him. That's when I noticed something else. There were drag marks near the tarp. Subtle, but they were there. The leaves and soil had been disturbed in a way that didn't match the rest of the area. I followed them back about 10 feet and found a second patch of disturbed ground. It was another tarp, smaller. I hesitated longer before checking this one. I already had a bad feeling. This one didn't have a body, but it did have a shovel. A cheap, rusted, wood-handled shovel with dried mud caked on the blade. Next to it was a half-empty bottle of water and a stained glove. There was a pack too, a small canvas one, and I looked inside it. All it had was a box of granola bars, a flashlight with dying batteries, and a handful of used zip ties. At that point, I felt something shift in my chest. Fear, real fear, not the kind you get from hearing a twig snap at night. I wasn't just dealing with a dead hiker or someone who'd gotten lost and passed away from exposure. Someone had put him there. Someone who might still be out here. I left everything where I found it and backed out of the clearing, taking the same path I came in on, carefully avoiding the drag marks. Every sound made me jump. Every branch that cracked made me flinch. When I got back to my campsite, the fire pit was cold. I'd let it burn out that morning. I tore down my tent, packed my gear in under 5 minutes, and started heading back toward the trailhead. My brain kept flashing images of that body. His open mouth, the bloat in his face, the zip ties. I made it out of the woods by late afternoon, sweating and shaking even though the temperature had dropped. I drove straight to the county sheriff's office, not stopping for anything, not even water. The officer at the front desk gave me a strange look as I stumbled in, covered in dirt and probably reeking of smoke and fear. I told them what I found, where I found it, and waited while they called in the proper people. That part was a blur. Lots of questions, lots of paperwork, and a ride back into the woods with a search team the next morning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room, lights on, hands trembling every time I closed my eyes. They found the body. The man had no ID on him, but they were able to identify him eventually from fingerprints. He was from Kentucky, 36 years old. Hadn't been reported missing because, according to his family, he'd gone off the grid years ago. No leads on who did it.
No suspects. No arrests.
They took my statement again, had me walk them through everything, but I didn't know anything else. I never saw anyone out there, never heard anything. The sheriff said it could have been a bad deal gone worse. Maybe the killer thought no one would ever find him that deep in the woods. They were almost right. I didn't go back to Crooked Hollow. I haven't been camping since. Sometimes I still think about the look on that man's face. The silence of the woods. The blue tarp with the rocks at each corner. There's no moral here.
No twist ending.
Just the reality that bad things happen, and sometimes you find them when you least expect it. You think you're out there to escape the noise of the world, but the world doesn't stop just because the trees are thick and the signal's gone. A few months after everything, the sheriff called to tell me they'd cleared the case from active status. Not enough evidence.
No witnesses.
Nothing to go on. The file was closed. That was that. I don't sleep well anymore. I still go to work, still stack pallets, still keep my head down. But I always carry my phone now, even when I'm just driving through town. And I keep a flashlight in my glove box, just in case. Some nights I dream I'm back in those woods, walking that same trail, only this time when I pull back the tarp, it's not a stranger. It's me. I was 29 when I decided to camp near the graveyard outside of Green Hollow, Missouri. The town was small, not much more than a few gas stations, some houses, and a diner that hadn't updated its menu since the early 80s. I wasn't from there, but I had driven through once years earlier and something about the place stayed in my head. Maybe it was how quiet it was, or how it looked like it had been left behind. There was a stillness I remembered, and back then I liked that sort of thing. It was late October of 2019 when I went. The air was already getting cold, but I had the gear for it. I had been planning a solo trip for months and wanted something different, something that would make me feel alone in a real way. I had already camped in forests and on mountain ridges, but the idea of pitching a tent near a graveyard gave me a weird sense of excitement. Not for any spooky reason. I didn't believe in ghosts or any of that. It just felt like a place where nobody would bother me, where the stillness would be deeper, more complete. The graveyard I picked was just outside of town, maybe a 10-minute drive down a 2-lane road that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years. There wasn't a gate or a fence, just a weathered wooden sign that read, Hollow Rest Cemetery. Most of the headstones were old, leaning a little to the side, some broken or worn down by time and weather. You could tell it hadn't been used in decades. The grass was patchy and dry, and thorn bushes had started to grow up along the edges. I parked my truck under some trees off the side of the road where it wouldn't be easily seen. I had my pack, a tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a small camp stove, water, some canned food, and a headlamp. I also brought a fixed blade knife I kept on me whenever I was out alone, mostly for practical use, but it gave me some peace of mind too. I hiked in about 100 yards, just far enough that I couldn't see the road anymore. I found a flat spot not too close to the graves, but close enough that I could see the headstones through the thinning autumn trees. It was quiet, really quiet. No wind, no cars, just the crunch of dry grass under my boots. I set up my tent with the opening facing away from the graves, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going with a little pile of wood I brought in a bundle. That first evening was calm. I sat on a rock near the fire, eating a can of chili with a plastic spoon, sipping warm water from my bottle. I watched the light fade slowly through the trees. The sun set behind the graveyard, casting long, stretched shadows across the old stones. It wasn't scary. It was peaceful in a weird way. Nobody around, nothing but the dead, and they weren't going anywhere. I turned in early, right after full dark. The night was colder than I expected. I crawled into my bag and zipped up tight, headlamp hanging from the top of the tent, giving off a soft white light. I read a few pages of a book, something I'd read before just to pass the time. Then I shut the lamp off and listened to the dark. It was the kind of silence you only get in forgotten places. No hum of electricity, no highway in the distance, just the sound of your own breath and the little movements of nature. Leaves settling, maybe a squirrel or two bedding down. I drifted off somewhere around 10, I think. The first thing that woke me was a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, like someone stepping lightly on dry grass. I lay still, holding my breath, listening hard. Nothing came next, just silence again. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or even a coyote sniffing around. I didn't get up. I stayed in the bag, my hand resting on the knife inside the tent next to me, and I waited until I fell back asleep. The second time, it was different. This time it was a high-pitched noise, fast and sudden, like the sound of metal scraping against metal. I sat up. My headlamp was within reach, and I flicked it on. The tent lit up white, the fabric glowing. Everything inside looked normal. My gear was in place. My boots, my bag, my coat. I unzipped the door slowly, trying not to make too much noise, and peeked outside. The fire was out. The air was colder now, and there was frost on the grass. I scanned the trees, the gravestones, the shadows between them. Nothing moved. I stepped out, knife in one hand, headlamp sweeping back and forth. Still nothing. I did a slow circle around the tent, then walked a little toward the graveyard edge. That's when I saw it. It was just a piece of wire, about 2 feet long, thin, rusty, hanging from a low branch maybe 20 feet from my tent. It wasn't there earlier. I would have noticed. It caught the beam from my headlamp and reflected just enough to shine. I walked over and reached up to touch it. It was twisted around the branch like someone had tied it there, but it was loose enough that it could swing. I didn't like it. I pulled it down and stuffed it into my coat pocket, then went back to the tent. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I kept listening, expecting to hear footsteps again, or something else, but nothing came. The next morning I stepped out and looked around again. The frost was thick now, and the whole graveyard looked pale and washed out. The wire was still in my pocket. I took it out, looked at it in the daylight. It didn't mean anything. It was just a piece of wire. Could have been part of a fence or something someone dropped. But I didn't believe that. Not anymore. I walked the edges of the cemetery, looking for signs of anyone else. I didn't see footprints or fresh tracks. The ground was hard, but not frozen. I could see my own trail from the day before, but nothing else. Still, the feeling stayed with me that someone had been out there. Not a ghost, not a spirit, just someone. That afternoon I hiked further out, tried to take my mind off it. I followed a dry creek bed that curved away from the cemetery and cut into the woods. I found a broken down hunting blind and some old beer cans. Nothing recent, no sign of anyone else. I stayed out there for a couple of hours before heading back as the light started to drop. When I got back to the tent, something was off. My tent flap was open, just a little, but I always zip it shut. Always. I stood there a minute, not moving, watching it sway in the breeze. Then I walked up slowly, knife ready, and looked inside. Everything was still there. My bag hadn't been touched. My food was sealed, but my sleeping bag was unzipped and laid open like someone had looked inside it. I stood still for a long time. Then I packed everything up. I wasn't going to spend another night there. I didn't care if I hadn't seen anyone. Someone had been there. Someone had opened my tent and looked through my stuff. I loaded my gear back into the truck before the sun went down, but I didn't leave right away. I wanted to understand why someone would come all the way out here. I walked back to the cemetery and stood among the graves. The stones were old, some unreadable, but as I moved further back, I found something new. Fresh dirt. It wasn't a full grave, just a small patch, maybe 2 feet wide, near the base of a tree. It looked like it had been dug and then filled back in recently. The soil was darker, loose. I knelt down and brushed some away with my hand. About a foot down, my fingers hit something. Plastic. A bag. I dug around the edges and pulled it free. It was a zippered pouch, covered in dirt. I opened it slowly, and inside were photos. Dozens of them, all printed from an old film camera. Some were black and white, some in faded color. They were pictures of campers, all in different places, woods, riversides, hills. Some alone, some in groups. Most were looking at the camera. Some were sleeping. The same tent styles, same gear brands. One photo showed a man who looked like me, sitting by a fire with a can in his hand. It wasn't me, but it could have been. There was nothing else in the bag. No names, no dates. I reburied it. I didn't take it with me. I didn't want that with me. I got in the truck and drove. I didn't stop in town. I didn't tell anyone. I just kept driving until I hit the interstate and didn't stop for hours. I haven't camped alone since. I still go out sometimes, but never by myself. And never near graveyards. I don't believe in ghosts, not even now. But I do believe in people. And some people watch. Some people wait. And some of them leave pictures in the ground where they think no one will ever find them. But I did. And I left them right where they were. I was 33 when I decided to take some time off and head out camping by myself. It was early October 2019. I had just left a stressful job in logistics at a warehouse in Boise, Idaho. I worked there for nearly 10 years. I was burned out and mentally worn thin. I needed some time to myself, no deadlines, no schedules, no people. Just trees, mountains, maybe a lake, and hopefully some peace. I'd camped alone before, but only at designated campgrounds. This time, I wanted something more remote. I looked over some maps and decided to head toward a forested area outside McCall, about 2.5 hours north. There was a spot I had pinned a while ago. A dirt road cut off Route 55 that led toward a wooded ridge that overlooked a small valley. I had seen it from the passenger seat once when I was on a weekend drive. It looked quiet, isolated, just the kind of place I was looking for. I packed up the essentials in my old Chevy Suburban. Tent, tarp, sleeping bag, propane stove, a cooler filled with some meat, fruit, water, and a six-pack. I had a decent flashlight, batteries, a compass, a backup phone charger, bear spray, a small hatchet, and a couple of paperbacks. I figured I'd stay 2 nights max. The drive was uneventful. Cold wind pushed down from the mountains, and low clouds hovered over the hills as I got deeper into the forest roads. I lost cell service somewhere past Cascade. I took that as a sign that I was heading in the right direction. By the time I turned onto the dirt road I had marked, the sky was already a dull gray, and the trees were starting to rustle harder in the wind. The dirt road twisted for miles, climbing gently through dense pine forests, with no signs or markers. I passed a few areas where old fire pits sat surrounded by rocks and logs, but they were too close to the road. I wanted more privacy. I drove for another half hour until the road narrowed enough that branches scraped the sides of my truck. I figured I was far enough from anyone at that point. I pulled off into a small clearing about the size of a gas station parking lot. There were pine needles everywhere, and no obvious trash or signs of recent campers. The clearing had a little ridge on one side, and past that, trees dropped off into a slope. It was quiet, nothing but the distant whisper of wind up in the canopy. I set up my tent near the edge of the ridge, flat ground, soft dirt. I laid down a tarp, pitched the tent, and rolled out my sleeping bag. Took maybe 30 minutes to get everything ready. I didn't build a fire, just used my propane stove to heat some can chili and sipped a beer while sitting on a fold-out chair. Around 6 p.m., it started raining. At first, it was light, just a patter on the pine needles and the fabric of the tent. I didn't think much of it. I crawled into the tent after dark with my flashlight and a book. The rain got heavier, tapping harder and harder on the nylon like a constant stream of gravel. Wind pushed through the trees, bending the higher branches and making strange creaking sounds in the distance. I zipped my sleeping bag all the way up and lay still, just listening to the rain and wind. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was a snap, like a thick branch breaking under pressure. I lay still. The rain was steady now, beating down hard on the tent, but I could hear something outside over it. Something soft, a kind of shuffling sound, not far from the tent. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer moving around, maybe something larger. I stayed still and listened harder. The sound was slow, deliberate. I thought about unzipping the tent and flashing my light, but something in my gut told me not to move. Not yet. Then I heard it again. A crunch. Not pine needles. Something harder, gravel, maybe? Like a boot. I gripped my flashlight and slowly turned it on without opening the tent. The light cast strange shadows through the tent fabric, and for a second, I thought I saw a shape move across the outside wall. Just a flicker. I froze again. Who the hell would be out here? I hadn't seen another vehicle in hours. The road was too rough for anyone to casually drive down, especially in the rain. I didn't even think anyone knew this spot existed unless they were deliberately looking for it. I waited maybe 5 minutes before unzipping the tent flap just an inch and shining the flashlight out. I didn't see anything. Rain hit the beam in a shimmering mist. The trees were black silhouettes. The ground was slick, wet with mud and scattered pine needles. I swung the light left and right slowly. Then I noticed something. In the mud, about 6 or 7 feet from the tent, there were prints. Not animal. They looked like boot treads, deep, wide, fresh. I knew for a fact they weren't there when I set up camp. The ground had been covered in dry needles and forest debris. These were sunk into the earth like someone heavy had been walking through during the rain. I stayed up the rest of the night. I never heard the sound again, and nothing else moved outside that I could see. I kept the flashlight pointed toward the edge of the tent door, waiting, listening. My heart didn't stop pounding until the sky started to get lighter around 6:30 a.m. When the sun rose, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I stepped outside and looked around. The boot prints were real. I followed them slowly, no weapon in hand, just the flashlight and the bear spray. The prints circled the backside of my tent, then disappeared toward the trees behind the ridge. They didn't follow a clear trail, just broke into the trees and then vanished into the wet brush and mud. No tire tracks, no sign of a vehicle, just someone on foot moving around my camp in the middle of the night. I should have packed up and left right then, but I told myself it was probably a hunter. Maybe someone had gotten lost or curious. Maybe they were just passing through. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I just didn't want to admit I'd made a mistake camping that far from anything. I stayed one more night. That day, I didn't do much. Just boiled water for coffee, walked around a little, and read inside the tent. My nerves were still wrecked from the night before. I kept looking into the trees, waiting to see movement. By the afternoon, the rain had picked back up, even harder than the day before. The wind howled now, and the tent shifted with every gust. Tree limbs knocked together in the distance like someone clapping wooden boards. I didn't sleep that night either. I stayed in the tent again, flashlight ready, bear spray beside me. The wind was so loud I couldn't have heard footsteps even if someone had been out there again. Every sound started to sound like movement. Snaps, creaks, water dripping in strange patterns. I kept imagining someone standing out there in the trees, just watching, just waiting. Then, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., something hit the tent. It wasn't wind. It was small, like a pebble or acorn, but it hit with force. I sat up fast and turned on the flashlight again. Nothing. The beam lit up the fabric but showed nothing outside. I waited, then another thud. Same kind of hit, small, fast. I unzipped the tent flap again and shone the light out, sweeping it across the trees. Still nothing, but I saw a mark this time, on the side of the tent, just above where I was laying. A dark smudge, mud maybe or something else where something had hit it. I didn't go back to sleep. When morning came, the rain had finally stopped. The air was still cold, and fog hung low through the trees like smoke. I went outside and walked a slow circle around the tent. That's when I saw it. In the mud, behind the ridge near a cluster of bushes, there was something lying half buried. A dark blue cloth, maybe a bandana or part of a shirt. I walked over and nudged it with a stick. It was a folded up shirt sleeve, torn off and crusted with mud. Underneath it, I found a Zippo lighter, scratched up but still intact. There were initials scratched into the side, JP. I don't know who that was. I still don't, but I didn't pick it up. I packed everything as fast as I could and got in the truck. It was maybe 8:30 a.m. when I left that clearing behind. The dirt road was even worse now, soaked and slippery, and it took nearly 2 hours to get back to the main road. I didn't stop, not once. When I got back to cell service, I looked up recent incidents in the area. I didn't find anything. No missing persons.
No warnings.
Nothing. Just an endless wall of silence. I never reported what happened. I didn't think anyone would believe me anyway. I haven't been camping since. Not alone. Not in the rain. Not anywhere off the grid. Every time I think about that night, the sound of footsteps, the boot prints, the torn shirt, I wonder how close I came to something much worse. And I know one thing for sure now. Next time I feel that gut instinct, that sense that something's wrong, I'll listen. Because whoever was out there, they weren't lost. They were watching. It was late November of 2016, and I had taken a full week off work to do something I hadn't done in years, go hunting alone. I was 36 at the time, divorced for over 2 years, and living alone in a small house outside of Kalispell, Montana. My job at the mill paid okay, but the stress of the schedule and the isolation from real nature had been wearing on me. I was never a very social person, and after the divorce, I got worse with people. I'd started spending most of my weekends watching outdoor shows or reading old field guides I had picked up from secondhand stores. The plan was to spend 6 nights out in the Cabinet Mountains. There's a section west of Libby that I always liked. A quieter stretch, no maintained trails, but plenty of elk sign if you're patient. I wasn't after anything big or trophy-like. I just wanted meat. I packed my old .308 8-bolt action rifle, my gear, enough dry food and water filters to last a week, and drove out on a Monday morning. I left my phone in the truck. There's no service out there anyway. I brought a Garmin GPS just to mark camp and use coordinates, but I mostly relied on my old map. I parked off a narrow logging road that hadn't seen traffic in years and locked up the truck. From there, I hiked 5 miles in, slowly climbing through dense pine and tamarack forest, with thick underbrush in parts and long stretches of open rock slides in others. I knew a place up on a ridge, flat enough to pitch a tent and far enough from any logging routes or campgrounds to avoid people. The air was sharp and cold, and I had to take short breaks as I climbed, adjusting my pack, letting my back breathe through the sweat. By the time I got to my camp spot, it was almost 3 in the afternoon. I set up the tent facing east and dug a small fire pit a good 20 feet from it. There was a slow creek downhill, maybe a 3-minute walk, and I could hear it faintly in the silence. That first night was uneventful. It was cold enough to keep most animals quiet. I laid in my sleeping bag, staring up through the thin nylon as the wind slid over the ridge. The sound of the forest at night always helped me sleep. The creaking branches, distant owls, that low rustle of needles when something small walks by. I fell asleep thinking about where to scout first thing in the morning. Day 2, I woke up with frost on the inside of the tent. I brewed some coffee over my little stove and sat watching the sky go from black to dark blue, then light gray. There wasn't much color that high up. I loaded my rifle and walked west over the rise, following a faint game trail I remembered from years ago. The forest there thinned out, giving way to thick moss and steep banks. It was quiet, no tracks, no scat, no real sign of movement. I moved slowly, taking my time, pausing every 20 steps to look and listen. That's how I like to hunt. Still, slow, quiet. I circled back after a few hours and made it back to camp by late afternoon. That evening, just before sunset, I thought I saw movement across a distant tree line. Too far to make out anything clearly, but something big enough to stir the branches. I watched through my scope for a while, but nothing else moved. I marked the location on my GPS and made a plan to check it out in the morning. That night, something woke me up. It wasn't a loud sound. It was subtle, like someone stepping on frozen grass, soft and deliberate. I opened my eyes and laid there, holding my breath, trying to listen past the sound of the wind. Then I heard it again, 2 soft steps. Then nothing. I sat up slowly, zipped the sleeping bag down quietly, and reached for my rifle. I didn't turn on a light. I just sat there, back straight, ears wide open. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I finally unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. The moon was out, casting long shadows. Everything was still. I didn't see anything, but my gut didn't let it go. I stayed up the rest of the night on edge, just watching the dark. Day 3, I hiked toward where I'd marked that tree line. The forest was thicker there, harder to move through without noise. I found fresh droppings, warm and moist, elk maybe an hour old. I slowed down, scanned the ridge ahead. I didn't see anything but felt I was close. I stayed out longer that day, maybe too long. I had to bushwhack through some tough thickets to get back. Got back to camp after sunset. I ate cold jerky and a granola bar, too tired to heat anything up. That night, I made a fire. Not a big one, just enough to give off light and smoke. I don't usually do that. Fires bring attention, especially from other hunters or animals. But something about the woods that night made me uneasy. I had the rifle across my lap and my back against a boulder. The fire crackled low, and the trees around camp looked different in the shifting light. Taller, somehow leaning. I didn't hear anything at first, but around midnight, I picked up a low, short sound. Not a footstep, not wind. Sounded like a click or snap, like someone slowly breaking a stick in half on purpose. Came from downhill near the creek. I stood up and walked away from the fire, slow and quiet. I crouched behind a tree and waited, eyes down toward the slope. Nothing. Then I saw it. Not clearly, just a shape, figure, tall, still, maybe 100 yards out, between 2 trees. I squinted, thinking it might be a tree itself or a shadow, but I swear it wasn't there a minute ago. I raised the rifle slowly and looked through the scope. There was nothing. I held my breath, scanned the entire slope. Nothing. I stayed out there for 2 more hours. I never heard another sound, but I didn't sleep either. By day 4, I was running on fumes. I told myself it was just my nerves, my imagination. When you spend enough time alone in the woods, your brain starts making patterns out of nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was around. I hunted again that day, but half-heartedly. My focus was gone. I kept looking over my shoulder, jumping at squirrels, freezing at every snap of a twig. I even considered packing up early, but the thought of hiking out 5 miles in the dark didn't sit well with me either. I decided to wait it out. That evening, I moved my tent, just 100 yards deeper into the tree cover. I didn't want to be in the same place twice. I didn't light a fire. I barely ate. I laid in the bag, rifle next to me, every sound outside turning into a possible threat. Then, just after midnight, I heard it again. Steps. Not animal steps, these were heavier, slower. Human. 1 step, then 2. Then silence. I waited. Another step off to the left. Closer. Then nothing. I sat up, heart pounding, grabbed the rifle, and unzipped the tent. I didn't go outside this time. I just sat there in the opening, watching the dark trees. Then I heard a new sound. Something brushing against my tent. Just the faintest swipe, like a hand dragging across nylon. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then it stopped. I waited in that position for what felt like an hour. Nothing else happened. Eventually, the cold forced me back into the bag, but I didn't sleep. I waited until dawn, then broke down the tent fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I packed everything, loaded the rifle, and started the hike out. The air was colder than the day before, and the sky looked heavier, like snow might come in. I kept checking behind me, stopping every few minutes to listen.
No birds.
No wind, just silence. When I reached the spot near the creek, I noticed something.
Footprints.
Not mine. Different tread. Wider foot. Heavier. They came from downhill and stopped near where I had camped the first night. Then they vanished. I didn't follow them. I kept moving, pace quick but careful, eyes scanning every ridge, every tree trunk. It was around midday when I reached the truck. The relief I felt when I saw it was still there, untouched, was hard to describe. I tossed my gear in the back, unlocked the door, and sat inside for a long time, engine running, heat blasting, doors locked. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. When people ask me about hunting trips, I just say it was cold and I didn't see much. But here's the truth. I went back 2 weeks later. I brought a friend with me, a guy I trust who knows how to track and shoot. We went up the same ridge, followed the creek down, and we found something I can't explain away. A small shelter hidden behind thick brush. Looked like someone had built it years ago, then started using it again recently. Old tarp, fire pit, broken tools, a pile of bones, small animals, maybe deer. There was even a makeshift bench made out of a log and 2 stumps. But the weirdest thing was the wall. It had photos nailed to it, old pictures faded by rain. Campers. Hunters. Some looked like Polaroids. Some looked taken with a zoom lens. None of the people were smiling. We left without touching anything. Hiked out fast. Called it in to the county sheriff's office. I don't know what came of it. They never followed up. I haven't been back to that part of the mountains since. I still hunt, but never alone. Never that deep. And I always keep my tent close to the road now, just in case. I was 34 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the woods of southern Missouri. It was 2022, and I had been working nonstop in St. Louis at a warehouse logistics job that paid all right but kept me cooped up in a huge concrete building for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. I hadn't had a break in nearly a year. My apartment didn't feel like a place to relax anymore. It was just another box. I had grown up hiking and fishing with my uncle in the Ozarks, so I figured I'd head that direction again. It wasn't a special occasion or anything. I just wanted silence. My plan was simple: 3 nights out in Baxter Hollow, a narrow, barely used section of the Mark Twain National Forest. No cell signal, no people, just trees, water, and a cooler of food. I wanted to be out of range of everything. I packed light. 1-person tent, a small sleeping bag, a folding camp chair, a jet boil stove, a little bear spray just in case, a .38 revolver I kept locked in a case in my truck, and a bunch of canned food, instant oatmeal, jerky, and trail mix. My cooler had a few cold drinks, some sandwich stuff, and apples. I tossed it all in the back of my old F-150 and left the city at 5:30 in the morning on a Thursday. The drive was easy, about 4 hours of winding highways, then gravel county roads. After a while, the road turned into a dirt path that got narrower until it wasn't really a road anymore. It was barely 2 tire tracks through the brush. I had studied the maps, and there was an old service trail leading into the hollow that had been used by rangers years ago but wasn't maintained anymore. I planned to park there and hike another half-mile into a clearing I'd found marked on a topo map. When I reached the trailhead, there was no sign, just a bit of chain link fencing twisted open where a path used to be. I pulled off to the side and killed the engine. The air was still. I didn't hear birds or insects, just a low breeze rustling through the tall oaks. I locked my truck, slid the revolver into my pack, unloaded, and started walking. The trail was rough, Tall weeds and saplings grew across it, and I had to use a stick to beat back some thorny branches. The ground was soft, covered in layers of pine needles and old leaves. After about 40 minutes, I reached the clearing. It was a flat, round patch surrounded by trees, maybe 40 feet across. No signs of other people.
No trash. No footprints.
Perfect. I set up my tent near a big rock that could double as a table. The air smelled like moss and bark. I felt calm for the first time in months. I unrolled my sleeping pad and laid my gear out. The sun was still high, so I boiled some water, made oatmeal, and sat on the rock to eat. I didn't hear any traffic.
No planes.
Just trees swaying and the occasional bird call. I explored the area before sunset. The hollow dropped into a narrow stream about 300 yards from camp. The water was cold and clear, and I filled my canteen with it after running it through my filter. I followed the creek a ways and found a few deer tracks, some raccoon prints, and what looked like coyote scat. No people tracks.
No rapes.
No signs of campers. It was exactly what I wanted. That night was quiet. I read a little by headlamp and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the trees. The second day started normal. I woke up early and stretched outside my tent. There was a thin layer of dew on everything, and it made the forest feel colder than it actually was. I made coffee, walked to the stream again, and took a slow loop around a hill nearby. The ground was a mix of soft dirt and flat rocks, and I took my time. I wasn't in any rush, but around mid-afternoon, I noticed something that didn't feel right. I was walking back from the stream when I saw boot prints on the trail near camp. Deep treads, not mine. Big feet. The prints came from the forest and stopped about 15 feet from my tent, then turned back the way they came. At first I thought maybe a hunter had wandered through. It wasn't hunting season, but sometimes people came out anyway. But these prints were fresh. I would have noticed them earlier. The soil was damp from morning dew, and the edges were still sharp. I looked around.
No voices.
No movement, just trees. It unsettled me. I hadn't seen a single vehicle parked on the dirt road, and there were no other trails nearby. For someone to show up here, they would have had to bushwhack miles through forest. Why walk all the way here and turn around without saying anything? I circled the clearing, scanning the brush. Nothing. I didn't see any gear. No trash. No rope or tarps stashed nearby. I went back to the trail and followed the prints for a while. They led away from camp and disappeared into denser woods, where the underbrush got thicker. I didn't like it. I walked back to my tent and sat on the rock for a while, watching the trees. The sun was already sliding toward the ridgeline, and shadows were starting to stretch. I thought about packing up, but I talked myself down. It was probably nothing. Maybe someone had come through earlier and I just missed them. Still, I kept my revolver close that night. The third day was warmer. I decided to stay near camp and fish a little down at the stream. I didn't catch anything, but it was peaceful. I kept checking behind me, glancing up the hill every few minutes. I didn't want to get surprised. Nothing happened.
No prints. No noise.
But that afternoon, just as I was rinsing out my pot after lunch, I heard a stick break somewhere up the hill behind camp. A dry, sharp snap. Not wind. Not a squirrel. Something heavy. I stood still and waited. Another snap. Then silence. I crouched down behind the big rock and stayed there. I had no reason to panic. Animals made noise all the time, but something about it felt off. It wasn't random. It was slow, one step at a time. After maybe a minute, I stood up and scanned the hill. I didn't see anything. No movement, just thick trees and undergrowth. I slowly walked to the edge of camp and listened. Nothing. I circled the clearing again and found no prints this time. No broken branches. It had gone still again. The kind of stillness that made your ears ring. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the tent with the fly rolled back, watching the tree line. I kept the revolver next to my sleeping bag and the bear spray within reach. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Crunch. Crunch. Then a long pause. Then crunch again. Whatever it wasn't walking like an animal. The steps were too even.
No scary. No sniffing.
Just walking, trying to be quiet, deliberate. I held my breath. My mouth went dry. I could hear my heart beating in my ears. I waited, gripping the revolver with both hands, but I didn't move. Eventually, the footsteps faded.
No breathing.
No talking.
No lights.
Just slow, steady steps going the way they came. I stayed frozen for another hour. I didn't dare unzip the tent or move. I just stared at the darkness. I broke camp at first light. I didn't cook. I didn't make coffee. I didn't even pack carefully. I just stuffed everything in my pack, grabbed the bear spray and the revolver, and started hiking out. Every 20 steps, I stopped and listened. Nothing followed me, but I never felt alone. When I reached the trailhead and saw my truck, I nearly ran to it. I tossed everything in the bed, unlocked the driver's side, and climbed in. I started the engine and locked the doors immediately. Then I saw something that made my stomach twist. On the driver's side mirror was a piece of fishing line tied in a little loop. A short piece, maybe 10 inches, looped once and pulled tight. Clean and deliberate. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I would have noticed. I didn't touch it. I backed up fast, turned onto the gravel road, and didn't stop until I was 2 counties away. I told myself it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe a hunter playing a prank. Maybe some strange, lonely backwoods guy out walking. But I've been out in those woods many times in my life. People don't just appear and vanish like that. And no one hikes miles into the thickest part of a hollow just to walk in circles and leave little markers on a stranger's truck. Someone knew I was out there. They watched me, maybe for more than a day, and they got close enough to leave a sign without me hearing them. That part still gets me. I didn't see their face. I never heard them speak, but they were out there, moving slow, watching, waiting for something. I haven't camped alone since. I sold the revolver a few months later and don't go more than a few hundred yards off any marked trail now. I've never gone back to Baxter Hollow. I don't even drive near it. Some places feel quiet because they're peaceful. Other places feel quiet because something is watching. I was 32 the summer I decided to go camping alone in the northern part of Idaho, near the border with Montana. It was July 2018, and I had just left my job at a property management company in Spokane. I needed time to clear my head. I'd spent almost 9 years behind a desk, and it felt like the walls had started closing in on me. So when I handed in my resignation letter, I packed my truck and drove east, not telling anyone where I was going except a note left on the kitchen counter in my apartment. I wanted real solitude, no cell service, no people, no work emails. Just trees, rivers, dirt, and silence. I'd read about a small national forest area called Big Fork Ridge. It wasn't a popular camping spot, which was exactly what I was looking for. No RVs, no kids on bikes, no picnic benches. Just raw land, some old Forest Service roads, and spots where you could hike in and set up a tent. I didn't want to be anywhere near a campground. I drove along a 2-lane road most of the way, then turned onto a gravel trail that narrowed to the point where tree branches brushed against both sides of the truck. After an hour of navigating rocks, potholes, and washed-out dips, I found a small clearing near a creek. It wasn't flat, but it was open enough to pitch a tent. I stepped out, stretched, and looked around. No tire tracks, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there in years. It was perfect. I set up my tent near a patch of pine needles where the ground dipped slightly toward the creek. The sound of water was constant, low and steady. I laid out my sleeping pad, unpacked my food container, and hung my bear bag up in a nearby tree. Then I walked a bit upstream to see if I could find a better fishing spot. I didn't bring a rod, just a line and hook, which I'd wrap around a stick and drop in where the water was deep enough. By the second evening, I felt like I'd melted into the woods. I spent most of the time gathering dry wood, cooking over a small fire, and walking miles in the trees with nothing but my backpack, knife, and a bottle of water. I saw a few deer, some elk scat, and once a set of what looked like mountain lion tracks near a downed log. But no people, no other campers, not even old beer cans or wrappers. It was like the place had been forgotten. That's why it bothered me so much when I found the boot print. It was the third morning. I had hiked up a hill just east of my camp, trying to get a view of the ridge. I climbed over a patch of loose rocks, and just beyond them, on a stretch of moss and soft dirt, there it was, a very clear, very recent boot print. Not mine, bigger than mine, probably a size 12. Deep tread, deep heel. The kind of mark you leave when you're carrying weight, maybe a pack. It was facing downhill toward my camp. I looked around and didn't see anything. The trees were thick in every direction. Pines mostly, with some old-growth cedar and fir. I waited a while, listening. Nothing but birds and wind. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Hunters came through these forests sometimes, even out of season. Maybe someone passed through and didn't stay. Still, something about the depth and angle of the print got under my skin. It wasn't on a trail. It wasn't headed anywhere. It was like someone had just stood there watching downhill. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I kept my fire small and didn't hang my laundry like I had the night before. I started looking over my shoulder more than usual. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. That night, I couldn't sleep. I heard something move near the creek around midnight. Could have been a deer, but I sat up in my tent and gripped my knife until the sound faded. Then I stayed awake until dawn, just listening to the woods. The next morning, I hiked back up to where I saw the boot print. It was still there. This time, I walked in the direction the print had faced, looking for more signs. I didn't find any at first, but when I curved down toward a dead hollow of trees, I spotted something strange. A piece of white cloth tucked under a log. It was small, like a torn shirt cuff or the edge of a rag. I nudged it with a stick and saw it was stained brown, maybe mud, maybe something else. I didn't touch it. I backed out of that area and returned to camp. I thought about leaving that day, but I'd only been out for 3 nights. I didn't want to panic over a boot print and a scrap of cloth. I tried to tell myself the odds of someone dangerous out here were small, but I moved my tent back deeper into the trees, away from the clearing, just in case. That night, the air felt different, colder, still. No breeze in the branches, just the sound of the creek, a little quieter now. I was lying in my sleeping bag when I heard a crack, not like a twig under an animal. This was heavier, a branch, then silence, then another snap, closer. I didn't move. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, then again. Something big was moving through the trees, but slow, deliberate, like it didn't want to be heard. I stayed frozen for maybe an hour. The sounds came and went. Once, I heard something like cloth brushing against bark. I never heard footsteps, just snapping and creaking. To first light, I packed my gear. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I threw everything into the truck and started driving. The narrow trail out felt like a tunnel. I looked in the mirror 100 times. I told myself I was being paranoid. I almost believed it until I stopped 20 miles later at a gas station in a tiny town called Oxbend. I went to the bathroom to splash water on my face and saw something on the back of my shirt. A smear of red clay. I hadn't fallen, hadn't sat anywhere wet. I didn't think much of it until I walked back to the truck and checked the back bumper. There were fingerprints, muddy, streaked, 4 of them. One was smeared like someone had gripped and slipped. They weren't mine. That night I stayed in a motel. I didn't sleep. I never reported anything. What would I have said? That I saw a boot print? Heard noises? Found a piece of cloth? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe it was some drifter living off the grid. But every now and then I think about how careful I had been. I think about the fact that I didn't leave tracks leading up to my hidden tent. I hadn't used a light. I hadn't made noise. And still, someone had gotten close enough to touch my truck while I slept out there in the woods. Whoever it was, they knew I was there. They just never wanted me to see them. And I never went camping alone again. I was 33 that summer, tired of work, burned out from everything. I had taken 3 weeks off from my job in London, rented a car in Bordeaux, and headed toward the countryside of southwest France. I didn't have much of a plan beyond getting away. I had packed a 2-person tent, a heavy-duty sleeping bag, some food supplies, a hiking stove, and a couple of books I never ended up reading. The only real idea I had was to explore the Dordogne region, old villages, limestone cliffs, rivers. I liked the quiet, the open space, and being left alone. I avoided campgrounds with amenities or RVs. I wasn't looking to socialize. I wanted isolation, something that felt untouched. I had found a trail near a small hamlet called Saint-Leon-sur-Vizier, with forest on one side and steep hills running toward the Vizier River on the other. It wasn't an official campsite, but wild camping is usually tolerated if you're respectful. I parked my rental car on a patch of dirt under some trees and hiked in with my gear. After about an hour of walking, I found a flat piece of land near a bend in the river. The ground was soft with old pine needles and moss, and trees formed a partial canopy above me. I couldn't hear any cars, just the wind and birds. I pitched my tent and felt better than I had in months. The first night passed without anything unusual. It had rained lightly, and I fell asleep to the sound of droplets tapping on the nylon tent. The next day, I walked along the river for a few hours. I found some old stone ruins, maybe part of an old mill, and ate lunch sitting on a large rock. I didn't see a single person the entire day. When I returned to my tent that evening, everything was as I left it. On the third day, I started noticing signs of someone else nearby. I woke up just after dawn and stepped out to pee. There were tracks in the dirt, not fresh enough to be wet, but not old either.
Boot prints.
Bigger than mine. I wear size 10.5, and these were definitely larger. At first I thought maybe I had made them the night before, but they weren't the same tread. Mine were a crisscross pattern. These had wide horizontal bars. I followed them for a few meters, but they disappeared toward the trees. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe a local hunter had passed through. Maybe someone else had decided to camp nearby. Still, it made me feel a little less alone than I wanted to be. I kept the rest of the day simple. Read a bit, boiled some pasta, and stayed close to camp. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement outside the tent. Something or someone cracking a twig not far off. It didn't sound like a wild animal. The steps were too deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, not daring to move. After what felt like a full hour, I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When I stepped out at sunrise, I found nothing obvious. No trash, no gear, no signs of another camper. But those same boot prints were back, this time closer to my tent. One was just 2 feet away from the flap. That day, I didn't hike. I stayed near the site, watching and listening. I kept expecting someone to appear, but nothing happened. I told myself I was overreacting. By the 5th day, I was tired of the nerves. I decided to move camp. I packed everything, hiked farther upriver, and found another clearing. This one was less open, a bit more hidden, surrounded by brush and shaded by tall beeches. I felt better knowing I had relocated. That night, things got worse. I had just zipped myself inside the tent when I heard something unnatural in the silence. Metal clinking, not loudly but steady, like a chain brushing against something. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, I heard what sounded like a deep exhale right outside the tent. It wasn't the wind. It was too close, too deliberate. I froze. Every part of my body tensed up. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't even breathe normally. My sleeping bag suddenly felt like a trap, like I was tied down. I waited, ears straining for anything. After several long minutes, I heard slow footsteps moving away, crunching leaves, one after another, then silence. When daylight came, I stepped out. Everything looked the same. Nothing had been touched. But this time, the boot prints weren't alone. There was a drag mark, a long scrape through the soil, as if something had been pulled. I followed it for a short distance before it veered into thick brush I couldn't easily get through. I told myself I'd had enough. I started packing immediately. I didn't care if it was 8 in the morning. I shoved everything into my pack, took down the tent, and hiked back to where I had parked the car days before. But the car was gone. At first, I thought I had taken the wrong trail back, but I knew I hadn't. The cluster of oaks where I had parked was right there. I even found the crushed beer can I had accidentally stepped on my first day. But the rental car, an old silver Renault Clio, wasn't there. There were no skid marks, no glass, no signs of a crash or break-in, just empty ground where I'd left it. My phone had no service. I wasn't surprised it hadn't worked for 2 days. I debated whether I should wait and hope someone passed by, but I didn't feel safe waiting there. I had a paper map, so I plotted the shortest route to the nearest village, roughly 6 kilometers. I started walking. It took me about 2 hours to reach the village, a tiny cluster of stone houses with closed shutters and one bakery that was just closing up. I waved down a man in a green Citroën van and used my limited French to explain I needed the gendarmerie, the local police. He seemed to understand and pointed me to Montignac, another 15 kilometers away. I walked that too. The police station in Montignac was small, tucked between 2 cafes. I spoke to an officer who spoke some English. I gave him my rental info, showed him my ID, and explained what had happened. He nodded politely, wrote things down, and told me they'd look into it. I asked if there had been similar incidents. He said no. I told him about the footsteps, the metal sound, the breathing outside the tent, the missing car. He nodded again but didn't look concerned. I checked into a small hostel that night, unsure of what to do. I used the landline to call the rental company. They said they'd send a replacement to Montignac and wanted to file a police report for the missing vehicle. I told them I had already done that. The next morning, I went to a local internet cafe and checked my email. Nothing. I looked up recent news from the area. Nothing about missing vehicles or strange people in the woods. I was starting to feel like maybe no one believed me. The new car arrived by noon, a small Peugeot this time. I told myself I'd drive back toward Bordeaux and end the trip early. But for some reason, I didn't. I felt like something wasn't finished. So instead, I drove back toward Saint-Léon-sur-Vézère. Not all the way to my old campsite, but near the area. I parked along a forest access road and walked part of the trail again. This time, I had a cheap pocket knife in my jacket and a flashlight. I stayed in the woods for maybe 30 minutes before I heard something that stopped me cold. A humming sound. Low, off-key, human. It was coming from farther up the trail. I turned off the flashlight and crouched low behind a tree. The humming got louder, then slower, like someone was tired or dragging their voice. And then I saw him, a man, tall and thin, in dirty jeans and a green military jacket. He walked slowly, dragging a length of chain behind him. He wasn't carrying anything else, no pack, no water, no gear. His head was tilted down, like he was looking at the ground as he walked. His hair was dark and long, falling past his ears. His face was thin, pale. He walked past me, maybe 10 meters away, never looking up. I didn't move. I waited until he had disappeared into the brush on the other side. Then I backed away slowly, retraced my steps, and walked back to the car. I drove to a nearby gas station and sat in the parking lot for an hour trying to calm down. I didn't go back to the woods again. I drove straight to Bordeaux and turned in the replacement car. I caught an early flight back to London 2 days later. I didn't tell many people about what happened, just my brother and one close friend. They both told me it was probably a homeless man or someone mentally ill living off the grid. Maybe, but that didn't explain the missing car, or how he found my new camp, or how he was always just close enough to hear, but never seen. A few months later, I got a call from the rental company. They had found the original Renault. It had been dumped near a quarry over 40 kilometers from where I'd parked it. The keys were gone. The glove box had been emptied. No damage, no fingerprints, just abandoned. They let me off the insurance charge. I think about that man sometimes. The way he walked, the way he hummed, the chain dragging behind him. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know if he was watching me the whole time or if I had just stumbled into his space and he didn't like it. But I do know I'll never go back there again. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I think about how close he came to the tent. Just 2 feet away, just standing there listening, maybe waiting. And sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I had unzipped the flap. It was the spring of 2013. I was 32 at the time, living in a flat just outside of Bristol. I'd gone through a messy breakup 2 months before, and I wasn't handling it very well. The walls of the flat felt like they were closing in on me, especially on quiet nights when the rain hit the windows and I couldn't sleep. I started to drink too much, stay up too late, and avoid phone calls from friends and family. I told myself I needed space. What I really needed was to get out of the city. I used to go camping a lot when I was younger, wild camping, not the kind with campsites and electricity. My dad taught me how to set up a shelter, cook over a fire, and hike with a pack on my back. After university, I stopped going. Life got in the way, but something about those memories stuck with me. I started watching videos online of guys camping in the woods alone, under tarps, in the rain. It gave me some strange sense of calm. I decided I was going to do the same. I would spend 2 nights alone out in the Dorset woods. No phone.
No distractions.
Just me, the trees, and some cold, wet weather. I picked a stretch of forest near an abandoned quarry between Wareham and Wool. I'd seen a few hiking forums mention it, secluded, overgrown, not patrolled or watched. The perfect place to disappear for a bit without being disturbed. I took the train to Wareham early Friday morning and walked the rest of the way, cutting across old logging roads and stone-strewn paths. The sky was heavy with clouds the whole day. It had that thick gray look that tells you it's going to rain whether you want it to or not. But that was part of the draw for me. I wanted the weather to be miserable. I didn't want sunshine or singing birds. I wanted to feel uncomfortable, cold, and alone. I thought maybe it would burn some of the weight out of me. I brought a military surplus tarp, a lightweight sleeping bag, a jet boil for heating water, a folding saw, and a few other basics. I hadn't used any of it in years. It felt good to pack it all and tighten it down, like I was taking some control back. By the time I got to the woods, it was already starting to spit. Not a full rain, but that fine mist that turns everything damp before you even notice it. The trees were dense, mostly pine and twisted oaks, with the ground covered in dead needles and soft moss. I found a small rise tucked between 2 hills and set up the tarp in an A-frame between 2 trees. I cleared out the space underneath, laid down a ground sheet, and stacked some logs at the edge of the clearing to sit on. I boiled water for tea and sat watching the rain collect on the leaves. The first night was peaceful. It rained harder around midnight, steady drumming on the tarp, but I stayed dry. I didn't sleep much, though. Every little sound seemed to stretch out in the dark. A branch creaking, water dripping, something shifting in the undergrowth. I'd forgotten how alive the woods felt at night, even when nothing was moving. But I wasn't scared, not really, just alert. It was the kind of feeling that kept your senses sharp. The second day I spent exploring around the old quarry. There was a path half swallowed by weeds and thyme, winding up around the edge of the pit. The rock walls were steep and wet with moss, the bottom filled with stagnant water and rusted metal debris. I saw what looked like part of an old van submerged near the far end. Must have rolled in years ago. The whole place had an eerie silence to it, like sound didn't carry properly. Even when I threw a stone into the water, the splash didn't echo. I didn't hang around long. I followed a narrow track back into the woods, deeper this time, further from the road. I found another clearing with a few broken down tree stumps and bits of what looked like fencing poking out of the ground. I figured it used to be farmland. I thought about moving my shelter there, but decided against it. My original spot felt safer, less exposed. That night, the weather turned worse. Around 7 p.m., the sky dropped and the wind picked up. I got soaked hiking back. My trousers clung to my legs, and my boots squelched with every step. The clearing was dark when I got back. Too dark. I lit a headlamp and checked the shelter. Nothing seemed touched, but I had this weird feeling in my stomach, like something was off. I told myself I was just tired and cold. I changed into dry clothes under the tarp, wrapped up in my sleeping bag, and made some soup. The warmth helped, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I barely slept at all. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I heard something. It wasn't an animal, not a fox or badger or even deer. It was the unmistakable sound of something walking. 2 feet, not 4, and not light steps either. Slow, heavy footfalls in the wet leaves. At first, I thought maybe it was an echo. Maybe I'd moved in my sleep and it was just the forest shifting around me. But then I heard it again. Closer. I didn't move. I lay there completely still, barely breathing. The tarp flapped gently above me in the wind, and I could hear rain hitting the leaves outside. But beneath it all, those steps. Deliberate. Crunch, pause. Crunch, pause. Whoever it was, they were walking in a wide circle around my camp. I had no torch on, just the dim glow from the dying embers of my last cup of tea. I reached slowly into my pack and pulled out my knife. It wasn't much, just a short fixed blade I used for food and rope, but it made me feel less helpless. I stayed like that for over an hour, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped eventually, or maybe I just stopped hearing them. I don't know. When morning came, everything was soaked and quiet. I stepped out of the tarp and looked around the clearing. There were boot prints, fresh ones. Not mine. They came from the south, circled the tarp once, and then vanished into the trees again. The ground was too wet to follow them far. I tried, but they disappeared into the brush after about 10 meters. I stayed frozen for a while, trying to decide what to do. My train back wasn't until the next morning. I could pack up and hike out, maybe try to find a B&B in Wareham, but part of me didn't want to admit that I was scared. I thought maybe I was overreacting. People hiked through these woods sometimes. Maybe it was a poacher or a local just wandering through, but they hadn't come close. They hadn't called out. They hadn't made a fire, just circled my shelter and left. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just one. I spent the day gathering dry wood, prepping a better fire pit, and reinforcing the tarp with extra lines. I wanted to stay busy, wanted to keep my hands working so my mind wouldn't spiral. I sharpened my knife, laid out everything in easy reach. When the sun went down, I was ready. I kept the fire small but hot, tucked under the edge of the tarp to keep the rain off it. I didn't eat much, just some dry bread and a bit of jerky. I had the knife on my lap and the headlamp looped around my wrist. I didn't plan to sleep. I sat there in the damp air, listening to the trees groan under the wind. It was sometime after midnight when I saw the light, a torch flickering through the trees. Not bright, just a faint bobbing glow. It was far away at first, maybe 50 meters or more. Then it moved closer, not fast but steady, like whoever held it wasn't in a hurry. I put out the fire, smothered it with a bit of dirt, and pressed myself back into the shadows beneath the tarp. My clothes were damp with sweat even though it was cold. The light kept coming, closer, then it stopped. I waited, knife clutched in my fist, breath shallow. The light didn't move for what felt like an hour. Then, just as slowly as it came, it started to fade away. It didn't turn and walk off. It just dimmed, like someone covered the torch with their hand, or turned it off completely. That was worse than seeing it, not knowing where it went. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the dark, heart hammering, knife on my lap. I listened to the wind, the rain, the trees, and the long silences in between. When the sky finally started to lighten, I packed everything as fast as I could.
No briac fast. No tea.
I shoved the wet tarp into my pack, slung it over my shoulders, and bolted. I didn't take the old trail. I cut through the forest in a straight line toward the road, even though it meant climbing wet rocks and slogging through patches of bog. I slipped more than once, got soaked again, cut my palm on a bramble, but I didn't stop. Every time I paused, I felt eyes on me. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see lights, but I felt them, like something just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. When I finally hit the gravel track that led toward the village outskirts, I didn't stop walking until I was standing on the main road, soaked and shaking. I checked into a cheap inn that night and took the train back to Bristol the next morning. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't really know how to explain it. There was no ghost, no monster in the woods, just a person, a stranger, someone who walked in the rain, alone at night, without a sound. Someone who circled my camp and stood in the dark without ever making a move. But that's what made it worse. It wasn't a story. It wasn't a dream. It was real. It was human. And the thought that someone was out there, in those woods, watching campers like me without a word or a warning, it stuck with me. I haven't gone wild camping since. Sometimes late at night, when the rain hits the windows in Bristol and I'm lying awake in bed, I think about that third night in the woods. I wonder what would have happened if I'd spoken up, or if I'd lit the fire bigger, or if I'd waited just a little longer before packing up and running. But I'll never go back to find out. I was 32 when I took a solo camping trip that I'll never forget, and not for good reasons. It was late October 2018, and I'd just come off a long and frustrating few months at work. I was living in Southern Oregon at the time, working for a small construction firm based out of Grants Pass. I'd been dealing with nonstop contracts, supply issues, and people not showing up on time. I'd had enough of the constant calls and texts. So when I saw I had a full weekend off, I didn't tell anyone. I packed my gear, filled up the tank of my old 2005 Ford Ranger, and headed out into the woods without a real plan. The place I ended up was somewhere north of Prospect. It wasn't a national park, more like one of those semi-maintained areas with no real ranger presence, just dusty roads and crude signs. I'd looked at a few satellite maps before leaving and found a narrow dirt road that looped into the forest and eventually dead-ended near a stream. That seemed good enough for me. I just wanted quiet. No people, no phones, no noise. Just trees, cold air, and space to think. I had enough gear for 3 nights. Tent, propane stove, water, a folding cot, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, a solar battery, and a pistol I kept in my glove box. I'm not paranoid, but I don't like going into the woods without protection. I'd seen too many weird things over the years. Strung-up animal remains, broken down cars miles from anything, strange campsites that looked like no one had left willingly. I drove for nearly 4 hours after leaving town, most of that on rough forest roads. By the time I found the place I'd seen on the map, it was already starting to get dark. The clearing was decent, about 20 yards across, flattened enough for a tent, and backed by a slope of trees that went up into the hills. To the east, maybe 50 feet away, there was a shed, an old one, rusted tin roof, faded red siding, padlock on the door. That should have been my first warning. Sheds like that don't end up that deep in the woods unless someone wants them hidden. But I didn't care. It was probably some logger's storage unit or an old hunting shack. I figured it had been there for decades and no one used it anymore. I parked beside a tree and pitched my tent a good distance from the shed. The stream was just down a small path past some brush. I checked it out before setting up camp. It was cold, clear, and running fast over rocks, probably snowmelt from higher elevations. I filtered a bottle of water from it just to be safe and cooked a quick meal as the sky turned dark. That first night was quiet, almost too quiet. No wind, no bugs, no rustling, just the sound of the stream in the distance. I remember sitting in my folding chair and feeling strange. Not scared exactly, just watched. The woods had that stillness that didn't feel right, like everything was holding its breath. I brushed it off. I'd been alone in the woods before. Sometimes your brain starts playing tricks on you. I got in my tent around 10 and slept pretty well, only waking up once when I thought I heard something knock against my truck, probably a branch falling. The next day was colder. I walked upstream a bit after breakfast, following the current for maybe an hour. The land sloped up and got rockier the farther I went. No signs of anyone else, no campsites, no boot prints, no tire tracks. That's when I started to realize just how isolated I was. This wasn't a place people came to. There were no wrappers or shotgun shells or fire rings, just wilderness. On my way back to camp, I stopped and looked at the shed again. From the front, it looked like a standard utility shed, maybe 10 by 10. The padlock was rusted but intact. There were scuff marks near the bottom of the door, like someone had tried to kick it or pry it open at some point. I walked around the back. There were no windows, just one high vent near the roofline and old handprints in the dirt on the siding. That made me uneasy, not terrified, but unsettled. Why were there handprints? Who'd touched it and when? I didn't dwell on it, but I didn't go near it again that day. I made lunch, collected firewood, and kept my ears open. I still felt watched. Every time I turned, I expected to see something or someone just ducking out of sight. That night, I woke up again around 2 a.m. I heard something moving, not close but steady. It sounded like someone dragging their foot in the dirt, pacing back and forth on gravel or leaves. I sat up, unzipped the tent quietly, and peeked out. Nothing, but the sound didn't stop. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the treeline. Nothing there. Then I aimed it at the shed. The sound stopped. I swear on everything I own. It stopped the second my light hit that shed. I waited a full minute, barely breathing. Then, slowly, I turned off the light and got back in the tent. I didn't sleep again that night, just listened. The next morning, the ground around the shed looked undisturbed. No tracks, no signs of animals. But there was something different. My truck door was open. I know I'd closed it. I never leave it open, not out here. I checked inside. Nothing was missing, but the glove box was open too, and the pistol was sitting on the seat like someone had taken it out and left it there. I didn't pack up. I should have, but I didn't. I told myself maybe I'd left it open without thinking. Maybe I'd gotten lazy, that it wasn't what it looked like. I forced myself to stay another night. I kept the pistol in my sleeping bag with me. That third night, the noises came back. Footsteps, more deliberate this time. Closer. I stayed frozen inside the tent, listening. I heard something sniff the side of the nylon wall. Something breathing low and heavy. I didn't move, just waited, counting the seconds. Then it stopped. Silence again. At first light, I packed up everything in less than 15 minutes. I shoved things into bags without folding them. I didn't eat, didn't boil coffee, didn't even wash my face. I just wanted out. When I turned the key in the ignition, my truck didn't start. The battery was dead. It had been fine yesterday. The lights hadn't been left on. I popped the hood. The battery cables were cut. Not torn, cut with something sharp. I nearly lost it then. My heart was thudding so hard it hurt. I had no way to call for help. No signal. No sat phone. I didn't even bring a flare. So I started walking. I left most of my gear behind. Just took my backpack, water, and pistol. I figured if I followed the stream back, I could eventually find the old road and flag someone down. I walked all day. No one passed me. I didn't see any signs of life, just more forest. I wasn't even sure I was going the right direction anymore. When it started getting dark, I found a rocky outcrop and set up a crude camp. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want anything to know where I was. That night was the worst. I was curled up in my sleeping bag under a rock ledge when I heard it. Something was in the trees again, moving slow, then faster, like it was circling me. I kept the pistol close, but I couldn't see anything. Just before sunrise, it stopped. I slept a little then, maybe 20 minutes. That's all I could manage. I kept walking at dawn. I walked for 2 more days, rationing water, chewing dry granola. I had no idea where I was. I just knew I had to keep moving. I passed an old rusted truck one morning, crushed into a ravine. Looked like it had been there 30 years. I started to think I might never make it out. Then finally I saw a sign. Literally, a wooden Forest Service sign, half rotted, but with an arrow and a trail name. I followed it until I found a fire road, then a real gravel road. I flagged down a trucker after a few more hours and begged him to take me to town. He didn't ask many questions. I never reported it. I don't know who would have believed me anyway. No one was killed. I didn't see anything clearly, but I know someone was out there, watching, waiting, and they didn't want me leaving. 2 weeks later, I went back with a friend and a generator battery. We found my truck. All my gear was gone. The shed? Still locked. But there were new drag marks in the dirt leading from the back of it. Something had been moved. I sold the truck that month. Never went back to those woods again. I don't even like camping anymore. I'll do it in public campgrounds, sure, with people around, but never out in the deep woods again. Never where there's no one else for miles, and definitely never near a locked shed. It was the summer of 2018, early July, when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the wilderness of northern Minnesota. I was 32 then, working a stressful job in Minneapolis, and I needed to get away from the noise, the people, the endless calls and emails. I wanted silence, fresh air, and time alone. I had always been a fan of the outdoors, but this trip was more about escaping the daily grind than about adventure. I packed my old, reliable Jeep with a tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, a small cooler, and the usual camping stuff: maps, compass, flashlight, extra batteries, first aid kit. I also packed my hunting rifle and extra ammo because, frankly, the northern woods could get dangerous. Not from monsters or ghosts, but from wildlife like bears and wolves. I wasn't scared, but I was cautious. I grew up in a rural area of Wisconsin, so I knew how to respect the wild. The drive north took about 6 hours. The highways gave way to smaller roads, then dirt roads, and finally a narrow path leading deep into the forest. I was heading to a spot near a small lake I had found on an old map from the library, off the beaten track where hardly anyone went. I wanted that kind of isolation. When I arrived, the sun was dipping low behind the pine trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. I parked the Jeep on a small clearing just off the trail and started unloading. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected because the ground was uneven and covered with pine needles. But after an hour, I had a small camp set up. A fire pit ringed with stones, a place to cook, and my tent pitched between two sturdy trees. That first night, the forest was alive with sounds. Owls hooted, insects chirped, and the wind whispered through the branches. I built a small fire and cooked some canned beans and a couple of hot dogs over it. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the darkening sky. The stars were bright, far away from city lights, and I lay back on a folding chair, staring up at the sky. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed, but the peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, a rustling coming from the trees around my camp. I froze, listening hard. The wind was calm, so the sound wasn't just leaves blowing. It was deliberate, soft footsteps, maybe, or something dragging. I sat up slowly and grabbed my flashlight, turning it on and scanning the dark forest. Nothing but shadows. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other small animal looking for food. I always kept my food packed tight in the Jeep, but maybe something smelled it anyway. Still, I didn't like the idea of something circling my camp at night. The next day, I woke early and checked my campsite carefully. The ground around the fire pit had small tracks, maybe from a fox or a coyote. Nothing too alarming. I reminded myself that this was normal. I was in their home. The day passed with a mixture of hiking around the lake, fishing, and reading from an old paperback novel I brought along. The lake was beautiful and quiet, its surface glassy in the afternoon sun. The trees stood tall and thick, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. I didn't see anyone else all day, which was fine by me. As the afternoon faded into evening, I prepared dinner again. This time I had some fresh trout I caught from the lake. I gutted it and wrapped it in foil with some herbs I had brought, then cooked it slowly over the fire. The smell was comforting. That night I felt a little braver. The strange sounds hadn't returned, and the forest felt like it belonged to me alone. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the crackling fire and the peaceful dark. But on the third night, things changed again. I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. to a louder noise, much closer this time. It was a sharp snap, like a broken branch or a stick crushed underfoot. My heart jumped. I reached for my rifle beside the tent and turned on my flashlight. This time, the beam caught movement. About 20 yards from the camp, I saw a figure moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal, not exactly. It was a person wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. The person moved slowly, deliberately, like they were trying to stay quiet. I froze. My mind raced. Who was out here at this hour? How did they find me? I didn't hear any cars, no other voices during the day. Was this someone lost? Or someone with bad intentions? I turned the flashlight off and stayed very still, hoping the figure would move away. Didn't. Instead, it stopped, just standing there in the darkness. For a long minute, I held my breath. Then, slowly, it started moving again. Not away from the camp, but circling it, keeping a distance but close enough to be seen. I didn't dare make a sound or a move. I just watched, gripping the rifle tightly. The figure vanished back into the woods after maybe 10 minutes. I waited another long while before I dared move. My hands were shaking as I checked the tent zipper and counted my gear to make sure nothing was missing. Sleep was out of the question after that. The next morning, I was too on edge to relax. I packed up my fishing gear quickly and decided to hike deeper into the woods, away from my original camp. Maybe I could find a new place, safer and less exposed. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled. The forest seemed different, quieter, almost too quiet. The birds weren't singing much, and the usual rustle of small animals was missing. Then I found it. Near a shallow stream, I spotted fresh footprints. Large boots, muddied but distinct. They weren't mine and they didn't look old. Someone had been here recently. I followed the tracks carefully for about half a mile, leading me to a small clearing with an abandoned hunting cabin. It was old, worn down by years of weather, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The windows were mostly boarded up, but one was broken, and I could see inside. Inside, the cabin was empty except for some old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught my attention was a pile of discarded clothing in the corner. Dark, rugged outdoor gear, similar to what the figure the night before wore. Something about the place made my skin crawl. I wanted to leave, but curiosity held me there a few minutes longer. I found a crumpled paper on the floor, a torn page from a newspaper, dated just a week before. It mentioned a man wanted for breaking into cabins and stealing gear around the area. That was the moment it hit me. Whoever I saw wasn't just some lost camper. They were a criminal, maybe dangerous, watching for campers like me. My heart pounded. I packed up and left the cabin quickly, moving back towards my Jeep. That afternoon, I decided to drive back to the highway and stay the night at a small motel. I wasn't safe in the woods alone anymore. Back in the motel, I called the local ranger station and told them what I saw. They thanked me and said they would send someone to check the cabin. For days after, I stayed in town, sleeping in a real bed and eating hot meals. I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I was safe from the forest shadows. 2 weeks later, I read a news update that the ranger team caught the man. He had been living off the grid, sneaking into camps and cabins, stealing supplies, and threatening hikers who got too close. The story said he was arrested without incident, but he'd been a real threat. The experience changed how I felt about camping alone. I still loved the outdoors, but now I knew real dangers lurked. Not monsters or ghosts, but real people with bad intentions. It was a hard lesson about trust, safety, and respect for the wilderness. When I finally went back to the forest months later, I never camped alone again. I made sure to tell someone where I was going, carried my phone fully charged, and stayed alert. The woods could be beautiful and peaceful, but they could also hide people you didn't want to meet. It was early September 2017 when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. I was 26 at the time, still working in construction, and I had a few days off between job sites. I wanted to be out where I didn't have to hear traffic, where I didn't have to look at another building going up or listen to another phone ringing. I just wanted quiet. I just wanted to sleep under the trees and wake up with the sound of birds and nothing else. No one around. That was the whole idea. I grew up in British Columbia, but by then I had moved out near Thunder Bay, Ontario for work. The forests out there are different, thicker, wilder in some ways, and they go on forever. I've been hiking and fishing out there a bit on weekends, but I'd never gone too deep into the backcountry. That week I decided I would. A guy I worked with once told me about an old decommissioned radio tower somewhere northwest of Thunder Bay. He didn't say much about it, just said it was maybe 3 or 4 miles off a forestry road, past a trailhead that was barely marked anymore. He said the tower had been there since the 60s, used during the Cold War maybe, and was shut down in the late 90s. Not fenced off or anything. Still standing, just rusting in the trees. I thought it sounded interesting and, more importantly, remote. So I packed up my gear, drove about 2 hours north, and turned off onto a gravel forestry road. I passed 2 trucks in the first 10 minutes, both coming the other way. After that, I was alone. The road was narrow, bumpy, and lined with pine and birch that got thicker and darker the farther I drove. Eventually, I found what I thought must be the trailhead. There was no real sign, just a metal post with a faint red stripe across it and some barely noticeable tire tracks veering off through the brush. I parked my truck off the main gravel track, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started walking. It was just after 2 p.m. The first half-mile wasn't bad. There was a path not well used but walkable. Animal prints, some fallen branches, but no sign of recent people. I liked that. I passed a swampy patch on the left and climbed up a small rise that leveled out again with a mix of thick pine and scattered hardwoods. The trail started fading after that, but I kept my compass and GPS with me. I wasn't worried. Around 3:30 p.m., I found the tower. It stood about 70 feet tall, streaked with rust, the paint long gone. It was one of those lattice frame types, shaped like a narrow pyramid, with some kind of small metal equipment box at the base. There was no sign, no fence, just empty forest around it. The clearing it stood in was maybe the size of a hockey rink. Tall grass, broken branches, and weeds growing up through old cables. The tower's ladder was still bolted on, going all the way to the top, but I didn't plan to climb it. I set up camp maybe 50 feet from the base, close enough that I could see it from my tent, but far enough away that I didn't feel like I was camping under it. I cleared some space, got the fire pit ready with rocks, set up the tent, and laid out my sleeping bag. I even had a small fold-up chair. I made a simple dinner, beans and rice I'd packed ahead, and sat by the fire as the sun dipped low. It was peaceful, just what I'd wanted. But things started to feel a little strange as the sky went dark. It wasn't one thing, just little things. The forest felt still, too still.
No crickets, no rustling, no distant owls.
I didn't think much of it at first. I told myself maybe the temperature had dropped. That can shut up the wildlife sometimes. But then there was the tower. Something about it looked different as the light faded. Not physically different, it was still the same rusted frame, but it felt out of place. Like it was too sharp, too angular against the trees. It cast a long, thin shadow that seemed to reach right toward my tent. I shook it off. I was just tired. I'd hiked a long way with a heavy pack, and I wasn't used to this kind of stillness. Cities and towns have a background noise that you don't even notice until it's gone. That's what I told myself. I put out the fire around 10 p.m., zipped up the tent, and got into my sleeping bag. I lay there for a while, eyes closed, listening. Nothing, just that strange, heavy silence. Then I heard something. Not loud, not close, but real. It was a metallic sound, soft but clear, like a loose wire tapping against a pole in the wind. But there was no wind, not even a breeze. I opened my eyes. The sound stopped. I lay still, waiting. Then it came again. Faint tap. Then again, but a little louder. It was coming from the direction of the tower. I sat up slowly in my sleeping bag, listening hard. The tapping stopped again. I unzipped the tent partway and looked out. The night was dark, but the moon was up, and I could see the outline of the tower clearly. Nothing was moving. I looked for any trees swaying, any animals. Nothing. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There was something at the base of the tower. It was small, low to the ground. I couldn't tell what it was at first. I thought maybe a rock. Then I thought maybe a bag or an old box someone had left. But I'd walked past that spot earlier. There was nothing there. It wasn't moving. It just sat there. I watched for a long time. I don't know how long, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. My knees started to ache from crouching. I didn't see any movement. No light. No sound. Eventually, I closed the flap and lay back down. I didn't sleep much. I kept my small camp shovel beside me, just in case. I didn't hear the tapping again. When the morning light came through the tent, I unzipped it fast and looked outside. The thing at the base of the tower was gone. I got up, heart thudding, and walked over to the spot. There was a mark in the grass. Something had been there. I could see where it was flattened, like a small crate or stool had been set down. There were no footprints.
No drag marks.
Just that one impression. I looked at the equipment box at the base of the tower. It was closed, rusted shut. I didn't touch it. I decided to stay another night, but move my camp to the other side of the clearing. I told myself maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. That night, the woods were still quiet, even more than the night before. I made a small fire, ate quickly, and went into the tent before dark fully settled. I left the flap unzipped just a little so I could see out toward the tower. Around midnight, I saw it again. The thing was back. Same spot. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a box. It was a person, or something shaped like a person. It was crouched low, knees bent, elbows on its thighs, head tilted slightly up, staring right at the tower. It didn't move. It didn't shake or sway. It just sat there, watching. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake whatever that was. I watched for nearly an hour. It didn't move once. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew it was dawn and the thing was gone again. This time, I didn't even pack up properly. I stuffed my sleeping bag in my pack, grabbed the essentials, and left the rest behind. I walked back fast, almost running, watching behind me the whole way. I didn't stop until I saw the roof of my truck through the trees. When I got in and started the engine, I didn't feel relief. I felt like something was still out there, watching. I drove straight home and didn't tell anyone. Not for a long time. It's been years now. I still think about it. I still don't know what I saw. Maybe someone lived out there, completely off-grid. Maybe it was just a hunter squatting near the tower. But why come back to the exact same spot 2 nights in a row? Why not move or speak or signal? Why sit there for hours without twitching? The weirdest part was that tower. I looked it up later, couldn't find any records of it. Nothing about its frequency, its ownership, or why it was shut down. Like it had been wiped clean. I've never camped alone since. I go with people now, and I never pick random clearings near old man-made structures again. I stay on marked trails in parks where I can see other tents and hear other voices at night. Whatever that was in the woods near that rusted tower, whether man, animal, or something else, it wasn't just camping. And it wasn't sleeping either. It was waiting. I was 35 when it happened. It was in the summer of 2016, and I had taken some time off work to travel a bit. I worked in a mid-sized town in the north of England, mostly doing freelance landscape photography and some graphic design on the side. I'd been saving up to do a road trip across Europe, something quiet and away from the usual crowds, and that's exactly what I set out to do. I wanted silence. Not tourist silence, but real silence. The kind you only get deep in the woods, when there's no phone signal and the wind is the loudest thing around you. France was my second stop after a couple nights in Belgium. I'd planned a few nights of solo camping in a fairly secluded area in the south-central part of France, near the edge of a large regional nature park called Parc Naturel Regional de Volcans d'Auvergne. Not many people went deep into the interior parts of that region, at least not at the time. It was just far enough from the bigger towns that you could go an entire day without seeing anyone. I had a reliable old green Citroën Berlingo that I'd converted slightly to carry a mattress in the back. But for this part of the trip, I wanted to sleep in a proper tent. Cooking on a small camp stove, gathering firewood, taking photos during the day and reading at night. I'd bought a new one-person tent from a decathlon in Lille before heading south. and after looking at satellite maps for a few hours the night before, I found what seemed like the perfect spot. An old trailhead near a faded dirt road that split off from a gravel logging path. No markings, no campsites, just empty woods and distant hills. I arrived there in the early afternoon on a Wednesday. It was quiet, like I'd hoped, with a soft breeze moving through the trees. There was no litter, no noise, no sign of anyone. I parked the car under some low-hanging branches and walked half an hour into the woods with my pack before finding a flat spot near a dry creek bed. I set up camp under some tall pines and a few younger beeches, just far enough from the trail that no one would spot me if they passed by. That first night was peaceful. I boiled some rice and vegetables on my little stove, ate on a folded bit of tarp while looking through my camera's photos, and then turned in early. The only sounds were distant owls and the wind shaking the trees every so often. The second day, I hiked around for hours, taking photos of the landscape and some half-collapsed stone walls that looked like they belonged to an old barn or maybe a shepherd's shelter. I came back to camp around 5 in the evening, sunburned and tired, and made myself a quick meal. I lay on my back in the tent that night, watching the tree canopy sway. It was quiet again. Too quiet, maybe. I fell asleep eventually but woke up just after 3 a.m. because I thought I'd heard something. It was like a short, distant crunch, the kind of sound you hear when a boot steps on dry twigs. I waited, listening hard, thinking maybe a deer had wandered nearby, but there was nothing after that. No more crunches, no brushing against branches, just wind. I unzipped the tent quietly and poked my head out. My small camping lantern gave off just enough glow to make the trees look taller and darker, but I didn't see anything unusual. I chalked it up to an animal and went back to sleep. But the next morning, when I walked down the dry creek bed, I noticed something weird. There were fresh shoe prints in the mud near a section where the creek had held some water from a rainstorm a few days earlier. The mud had hardened slightly, but these prints looked recent, still soft around the edges. Too soft to be mine because I hadn't been down that stretch the day before. And they were too big for me, maybe a size 11 or 12. The treads were different too, more like heavy work boots, while mine were trail runners with narrow grooves. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. I thought maybe someone had stumbled across the area by accident, maybe a hunter or hiker. It was rural France. People still worked in forests, collected mushrooms, or hunted game. But it still didn't make a lot of sense. There were no tire tracks near the trailhead, no noise, and no other sign of people. I told myself it didn't matter. People hike, people walk. Nothing wrong with that. That night, I couldn't relax the same way. I cooked, ate, then sat with my back to a tree for a while, watching the darkness around me. The wind had died down completely. I had no music, no podcasts, nothing. Just me and the occasional rustle of a small animal. I kept my lantern close. I slept lighter, waking up often. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, more like a soft thump, like something being dropped. I stayed perfectly still, heart racing, listening. No more noises came. The following morning, I looked around the perimeter of the camp. Nothing disturbed, no tracks, but when I went over to the side where I'd stacked some extra firewood, I saw that 3 small logs were missing. I knew I hadn't used them yet. I'd stacked them neatly, end to end, like a short wall, but now there were only 2 left. Again, I tried to explain it away. Maybe I'd miscounted. Maybe I used them and forgot, but it didn't sit right. I felt that hollow sensation in my chest that comes when you know something's off but don't want to accept it. I decided I'd stay 1 more night and then move on. I'd done enough camping here, taken plenty of photos. Better to head east and get closer to Switzerland, maybe find another forest near the border. I packed my bag ahead of time and stowed some of my gear back in the car so that I could leave early in the morning. That last night was when it happened. I didn't bother making a fire. I cooked something quick and then zipped myself inside the tent before it was even dark. I left the lantern on low and kept a small folding knife nearby. Not that I thought it would help, but it gave me something to hold. I lay there for what felt like hours, eyes fixed on the ceiling of the tent, barely blinking. Around midnight, I heard movement. This time, it wasn't distant. It was close, leaves crunching softly, then a pause, then another slow, careful step. I froze. The steps came closer. They weren't rushed or clumsy, they were measured, like someone deliberately trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. My breathing got shallow. I didn't move. My hands gripped the sides of my sleeping bag so tightly they started to go numb. The steps stopped maybe 5 or 6 meters away from the tent. Total silence again. Then I heard something even worse. Breathing. Not mine. Someone else's. Shallow and slow. Just outside the tent. I didn't dare move. My lantern was still glowing faintly, and I knew the light must have been visible from outside. I shut my eyes and held my breath, hoping whoever it was would think I was asleep. Maybe they'd leave, but they didn't. Instead, I heard the sound of fingers brushing against the tent fabric. It was slow and light, moving from one side to another, then pausing, then brushing again. Almost like they were trying to feel the shape of my body through the material. I stayed frozen. Every second felt like it stretched into a full minute. Then, finally, the fingers stopped. No footsteps followed. Nothing. Just silence. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, still as I could be, for the rest of the night, knife in hand. Every creak of a tree made my stomach twist. At first light, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out, shaking. The forest was still. I looked around in every direction but saw no one. No sign of movement, no footprints, nothing obvious. But I knew what I'd heard. When I made it back to the car, I found something else that chilled me to the bone. On the back window of the Berlingo, right above the dusty glass, someone had drawn a simple X with their finger. It hadn't been there when I packed up the night before. I know that for a fact because I wiped that glass down after loading up. I threw the rest of my gear into the car and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I reached a proper campsite near Clermont-Ferrand, a commercial one with families, caravans, toilets, and light poles. I didn't sleep well that night either, but at least I wasn't alone. I never reported it to anyone. What would I even say? That someone might have crept through the forest to stand outside my tent and listen to me sleep? That someone drew a mark on my window? They'd laugh. Or worse, they'd ignore it. I still think about it, though, especially the breathing. It wasn't fast or panicked. It was controlled, intentional, like someone who had done it before. And the worst part? There were no threats.
No warnings.
No violence. Just that silence, that patience, that quiet presence in the night, as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. I haven't camped alone since. I still travel, still take photos, but I stick to places with other people nearby. I sleep in hostels or hotels. The woods don't feel the same anymore. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear breathing that isn't mine. And every time I park my car somewhere quiet, I check the windows. I wipe them clean, just in case someone decides to leave another mark. I was 31 when I camped alone in a graveyard for the first and last time. It was late October 2017, just a few days before Halloween. I wasn't doing it for fun, or for some dare, or even out of boredom. It was just something I told myself I'd do. Something that kept coming back to me every time I was out in the woods or scrolling through old maps. I guess it started when I was younger and used to walk past this overgrown hill on the edge of our town. There was something about that slope, something about the stone wall with moss curling through the cracks, and the rusted iron gate hanging half off the hinges. The graveyard had no official name that I knew of. The oldest headstones dated back to the mid-1800s, most of them worn to near blankness. Some had fallen over completely. Others had little iron fences around them, rusted and half-buried in leaves. It was called Graveyard Ridge by most locals, if anyone talked about it at all, which they rarely did. It sat about 2 miles outside of Bremer Hollow, Tennessee, up a steep incline off a gravel county road that didn't show up on Google Maps. No signs, no maintenance. No one had been buried there in nearly 70 years, maybe more. I had an old topo map from the 60s that showed it plainly, right at the edge of what was once farmland, long since grown wild. The ridge overlooked a dense forest to the south and a dried creek bed that only carried water in the spring. That October, the weather had been unusually dry, and the leaves were already thick on the ground. That week, I had taken time off from my job at the automotive plant. I didn't tell anyone what I planned to do. I just packed my gear, loaded my old Toyota pickup, and drove out before sunset. I parked at the base of the hill, where the gravel shoulder widened out just enough for a single vehicle. It felt remote, though technically it wasn't. There were still a few farms out that way, and one old hunting cabin half a mile to the east. But on that ridge, with the wall around it and no living soul for 100 yards, it felt like the middle of nowhere. I hauled my pack up the slope slowly, trying not to slip on the dead leaves, and passed through the gate like I had done a few times before, always during the day, never like this. The graveyard wasn't huge, maybe 60 or 70 graves total. There were no big monuments, no fancy statues, just simple limestone and granite markers, many of them leaning at odd angles or overtaken by thick roots. I picked a flat area near the center, away from the edge of the ridge and out of the path of a large white oak that looked like it could come down if the wind picked up. I cleared a space of leaves and twigs, laid down a tarp, and set up my small one-man tent. I didn't bring a fire kit. No wood stove, no lanterns. Just a flashlight, a headlamp, a knife, some cold food, and a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that buzzes in your ears after a while.
No backs.
No wind, just the creak of the trees every so often, and the occasional sound of a leaf falling. I walked around a bit before dark, just to get a feel for the layout again. Some of the graves had names I could still read. Rebecca Ingram died 1892.
Charles Girout, 1911-1945.
One said simply Baby Girl, January 1923. Most had dates that ended before the Second World War. When the sun dropped, the air turned sharp. I pulled my coat tight and sat on a small folding stool, just outside the tent. There was no moon that night, or if there was, it hadn't risen yet. The darkness came quickly, and with it, the stillness deepened. I wasn't scared. Not then. I'd camped alone plenty of times, and I'd done it in weirder places. Abandoned barns, creek beds, even a collapsed fire lookout once up in West Virginia. But there was something different here. Something in the way the ground felt. It wasn't just that it was a graveyard. It was more about how the whole place seemed sunken in on itself, like the rest of the world had moved on and left this ridge to rot. Around 10, I got into the tent, zipped it up, and laid still in the sleeping bag. The nylon shell rustled when I shifted. Outside, I could still hear the occasional tick of bark falling or a distant owl. But somewhere around midnight, I woke up wide-eyed, with that tightness in my chest you get when something feels off. I listened. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. Maybe a deer walking through the brush. But I heard no hooves, no crunch of movement, just a kind of stop-start rhythm of faint sounds, like something moving in spurts and then going still. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. I unzipped the tent slowly and poked my head out. Cold air rushed in. I turned on my headlamp and swept the beam slowly across the rows of graves. Nothing, just stillness. I listened again. Then I saw something. It wasn't movement. It was absence, a shape where there should have been leaves. About 30 feet away, behind a crooked stone with a chain link border, there was something dark, no taller than a person but broad. Squatting maybe, I flicked the beam that way again. It was gone. My stomach tightened. I stepped out of the tent slowly, the light jittering slightly as I moved. I tried to convince myself it was just the light catching on an uneven grave marker, but I felt watched, not just watched, surrounded. Even though there was nothing in my sight line, I could feel pressure on the back of my neck like something was just behind me. I spun around too fast. Nothing, just graves. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting outside the tent with the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My breath fogged in front of me. My knuckles were white with tension. I didn't hear anything else, not really, but I never felt alone. When morning finally came, the light broke slowly over the ridge. It hit the trees first, then the graves. Dew covered everything. My pack was damp. I felt stiff, my muscles cramped from sitting hunched for hours. I packed fast, too fast. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just wanted to be off that hill. But before I left, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. About 15 feet from my tent, near a grave I hadn't paid much attention to, the leaves had been pushed aside. Not scattered, but brushed away in a clear arc, like someone had knelt there and swept them with their hand. Beneath it, the dirt was soft, damp, fresh-looking.
No footprints.
Just that curve in the ground like something had shifted underneath. I didn't touch it. I didn't try to find out more. I just walked away, down the hill past the gate to the truck. I didn't stop until I was back on the county road, gravel pinging under the tires. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not really. Not for a long time. A few weeks later, I went to the county records office in Fairview. I looked up the parcel map for that part of the ridge. Turns out the land was technically still owned by a church that had shut down in 1964. No maintenance records, no preservation efforts, just a note in the margin. Asterisk burial ground inactive. Plot maintenance ceased. Asterisk I tried asking an older man at the records counter if he knew anything about the graveyard. He said his uncle used to work the land nearby back in the 40s. Told me they used to bury stillborn babies and unclaimed folks up there.
No caskets. No ceremony.
Just holes dug by hand, sometimes not even marked properly. I never went back. The tent I used that night I gave away the next week. I couldn't bring myself to use it again. Every time I looked at it, I felt that cold knot in my chest, the one I had sitting in the middle of a graveyard under a black sky with something shifting just out of view. It wasn't ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe there are places where the past doesn't stay buried. And sometimes, when you camp alone on a forgotten ridge full of forgotten people, you don't leave with just your gear. You leave with something that never quite lets go. I was 16 when I last went camping with my grandfather, William Trenton. It was the summer of 1996, a dry one that year, up in the woods near Crescent Ridge in northern Idaho. The kind of summer where the ground cracked beneath your boots and the pine needles felt like straw. He was 72 at the time and getting slower, but still strong. The kind of man who wouldn't ever ask for help even if both his knees gave out. He'd always taken me out to those woods when I was younger. We'd fished the lakes, set traps for squirrels, cooked meat over open flame. But that summer felt different. He said he wanted one last real camp. No tents, no maps, no markers. Just 2 sleeping rolls, 2 knives, and an old .30-30 lever-action rifle he kept oiled like it was a family heirloom. We set out on a Thursday morning. I remember it being a Thursday because the gas station receipt in his glove box said so, from when we topped off the tank and bought jerky and matches. The plan was to hike deep into the woods past where the trail maps stopped showing anything useful, then make a camp near a stream he remembered from years back. The first day went like they always did. We parked his old Ford Bronco off a dirt service road, locked up the valuables under the seat, and headed northeast into the trees. I carried the bedrolls and extra food in a big canvas rucksack that burned my shoulders by midday. He carried the rifle, a hunting knife, and a heavy canteen slung across his chest. The trail, if you could call it that, vanished after about 2 hours of walking. We made camp that night in a grove near a small hill. The fire burned hot, dry twigs snapping like gunshots as we warmed our hands and grilled beef jerky between two hot rocks. I remember how quiet it got after sundown. So quiet that I could hear my own pulse sometimes. No wind, no birds, just that hard silence that sits on your chest like weight. That first night I barely slept. Not from fear, but from restlessness. The ground was hard and uneven, and I kept feeling small rocks and sticks through the canvas. I must have shifted around 30 times before dawn. My grandfather didn't move once. On the second day, we pressed deeper into the woods. Trees grew tighter together the further we went, some so close their trunks were fused with each other. Around noon, we came across a pile of rusted cans, boots, and broken fishing poles, all in the middle of nowhere. Looked like someone had left camp in a hurry. Everything was brittle with age. The labels on the cans were faded to white, and the leather on the boots had cracked like old paint. We didn't stop long. My grandfather only paused, looked at it for a few seconds, and kept walking. Around 3 p.m., we hit the stream he remembered. Still ran strong, even in the dry summer. Water was cold enough to hurt your teeth when you drank from it. We filled our canteens and decided to make that our second camp spot. We set up under a large pine tree that had split from lightning years ago, a hollow chunk running up its core. The wood inside was dark and smelled of burnt sap. We cooked canned beans and ate them with flatbread while sitting on mossy stones. I watched dragonflies hover over the stream and listened to the odd rustle of branches behind us. That night was colder, even though the air had been warm all day. I woke up around 2 a.m., freezing, despite the fire still flickering a few feet away. My grandfather was awake too, sitting on a flat rock just staring out into the woods. I didn't ask him what he was doing, because I knew he didn't just sit like that for no reason. The third day was when things started to get strange. Not supernatural, nothing like that, but the kind of strange that you can't explain with logic. We were planning to hike further up toward a ridgeline he'd always called Old Pine, a stretch of high ground covered in twisted, stunted trees. Supposedly there were elk trails and deep caves carved into the rock face from old mining days. The woods felt tighter that day, not just visually but emotionally. Hard to describe. The branches hung lower. The air smelled sour, like wet iron. And we started seeing marks. Tree trunks stripped of bark in narrow, vertical lines, not like claw marks, but like someone had scraped them with a knife, deliberate and uniform. Every few hundred feet, another one. After about 2 hours, we found the first sign of real trouble. A clearing, about 30 feet across, perfectly round, with no vegetation, just dry, cracked earth. In the center was a tree stump, burned black, with nails driven into the top in odd patterns. Dozens of them, all different sizes, some bent, some new. Around the stump were broken bits of metal, glass jars filled with yellow fluid, and a torn piece of blue tarp caught in the roots. We didn't camp there. We didn't even stop to eat. My grandfather turned back toward the stream without a word, and I followed him. His posture was different after that, tense, like he was listening to something just out of earshot. That night, I heard something move through our camp. Not a deer or a bear, something on 2 feet, steady, deliberate steps. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, staring at the dim shape of my grandfather lying still as a stone beside the fire. The steps circled once, slow and calm, and then they were gone. I didn't sleep again until the sun was up. On the fourth day, he said we were heading back, but not the same way we came. The woods weren't safe, he said, though he didn't say it out loud. I just knew from the way he walked, faster, always checking over his shoulder. We skirted the burned stump clearing by half a mile, but still saw signs of it for hours. More bark-stripped trees, more glass jars tucked into branches. Once, we found a pile of bones laid out in a neat circle. Looked like they belonged to raccoons or rabbits, all stripped clean. By late afternoon, we realized we were lost. Not hopelessly, but far enough off course that neither of us recognized the terrain. My grandfather didn't say anything, just kept walking as if motion alone would straighten the map in his head. We came across an old trapper's cabin around dusk. It was small, sagging, made of blackened logs with no roof. Inside, we found animal skins nailed to the walls and a pile of bones in one corner. They looked fresh, not bloody but new, pale and sharp. The smell was something awful. I stepped outside and vomited near a root. We didn't sleep that night, just built a fire and sat back to back beside it. At one point, deep in the night, we heard a loud, wet snapping sound about 100 yards away, like something breaking branches in its mouth. Then silence, heavy silence. When dawn came, I noticed my grandfather had the rifle pointed downhill, aimed at nothing. His finger was resting gently on the trigger. He looked calm, almost like he'd been expecting whatever was out there. We pushed hard on the fifth day, uphill and westward, hoping to hit the dirt road again. My legs ached. I had blisters across both heels and the skin on my shoulders was raw from the rucksack straps. Around midday, we crested a ridge and saw the old road below, winding like a snake through the pines. We made it to the truck by late evening. The Bronco was untouched, though there were odd smudges on the passenger side mirror, like fingerprints, too long to be normal. My grandfather wiped them off with his sleeve without saying a word. We never talked about that trip again. He passed away 3 years later, a stroke while fixing a fence on his land. At the funeral, I didn't bring it up to anyone. I kept the memory sealed tight in my head. But sometimes, I go back over it all in my mind. The stripped trees, the jars, the burned stump, the feeling that we were being watched from just behind the trees by someone who knew those woods better than we ever would. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't some tale of monsters or forest spirits. It was something worse, something real. A person or people out there living in a way that didn't belong to the rest of the world anymore. People who didn't want to be seen, who'd made the woods their territory with their own rules and warnings. I haven't been back to Crescent Ridge since. Never will. I still hike sometimes, but never without a map, never without backup, and never without telling someone exactly where I'll be. Because now I know, there are places in the woods that don't want you there. And if you see the signs, the nails, the jars, the quiet, you turn around. You don't ask questions. You don't explore. You leave.